And final last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the McMaster controversy. We spent 2 weeks on it, and definitely because it's probably the most important, in one sense, incident in Baptist history in the 20th century, Canadian Baptist history, but definitely Ontario Baptist history. Maybe other parts of Canada not as significant, but definitely for Ontario and Quebec, it is very, very important. The Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches ultimately has its roots in this controversy, which is another reason why I spent so much time on it. And dominating the controversy, obviously, are personalities. And it was very easy for a focus on personalities to sidetrack the theological issues. And Dr. Shields was a larger than life personality in so many ways. I have known over the years men who knew him well, who studied under him. In fact, one of the things that struck me, I was the principal of Toronto Baptist Seminary for about 3.5, 4 years, from 2003 to 2006, so 4 years. And what struck me one of the first times I ever went into the academic building of Toronto Baptist Seminary, which is there at the corner of Jarvis and Gerrard on the northeast corner, right next door to Jarvis Street Baptist Church, was they at that time, they still had all of the class photographs of every year going back to 1920, would be 29, 1930. The first class was in 27. So it was a 3-year course. So it probably would have been the first graduates would have been around 1930. And they had the way that they do these, they have the various graduates and then some of the professors, etc. And that sort of thing, as a historian, just kind of stokes the fire of interest. And so I spent a lot of time looking at those. And what struck me was virtually every one of the founding figures in the fellowship studied under D.T. Shields or studied at Jarvis Street. There were a few exceptions, but the dominant group of men who came together in 1953 to found the Fellowship of Evangelical Baptist Churches in Canada, Shields had been an overwhelming influence upon these individuals. And Shields is a complex figure. We actually all are complex figures, but he's particularly complex. And the difficulty of assessing Shields, and I want to talk a little bit about leadership tonight. The difficulty of assessing Shields is that he could spark very different reactions in people. One of the early figures in Fellowship Baptist history, he died in 1965, was Morley Hall. Some of you may know the name. He was a prime mover in the formation of the fellowship. He had worked with Dr. Shields during the 20s and 30s. He had gone out of the old convention with Shields. And then in the 40s, as we will see, he and a number of others ran into problems with Dr. Shields. Morley Hall tells the story, it's an anecdote which he would tell in the 50s and 60s, about two friends who were women sitting in Jarvis Street Baptist Church on a Sunday morning, probably one of those days when the place was packed, 1,500 people. They might have had to wait an hour to get a seat, that sort of thing, because that was very common in the 20s and the 30s. And on this particular Sunday, Jarvis Street, if you know Jarvis Street, has it's kind of a mustardy yellow painting inside. I never liked it. They kind of have to do that because they have a ceiling, a glass ceiling portion of it, which is in yellow. And so they have to do a complementary color. And on this particular day, a shaft of light was coming through one of these windows and striking Dr. Shields as he was leading worship. And after the service, one of the women, one of these two friends, remarked to the other woman, she said, you know, as I looked at Dr. Shields today, I was positive I saw an angel of God. Did you notice that? She said, when the light struck his face, how angelic he looked. The other woman said, actually, no. In fact, I had the opposite. experience. She said, as the light struck him, I'm sure I was looking at something demonic. And it's a great little anecdote. And I assume it's true. Morley Hall told this on a number of occasions. And it's a great little anecdote because it well captures the polarizing effect that Dr. Shields could have on people. And so I want to talk a little bit about leadership today, and then the course of the churches that came out of the fellowship, came out of the old convention in 1927, and they would form within a year what we call the Union of Regular Baptist Churches, and that history down to the late 40s. In 1927, this is where we ended last week, after 3 years of very intense debate, and really, from Shields' point of view and McMaster, all-out war. Now, thankfully, it wasn't like what we're seeing horrifyingly in Eastern Europe, but it scarred Baptist life. And it still is part of the landscape of Baptists in Ontario in many ways. And finally, in 1927, the convention, known as the Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec, had had enough with Shields. In 26, they had ruled that he was no longer welcome as a delegate from Jarvis Street Baptist Church. And in 27, they went to Queen's Park to get a private members bill to retool their constitution so they could expel Jarvis Street. And to me, it's unconscionable that the Baptist church and group of churches would turn to the state to enforce any sort of decisions like this. But be that as it may, they did. And in 1927, at the 27 convention, TT was there. He turned up, even though he'd been told he couldn't be a delegate. And Jarvis Street, along with 12 other churches, were read out of the convention. They were expelled. Among them, in Hamilton, Stanley Avenue Baptist Church. Houston Street Baptist Church, I don't think, actually, I think it was one of them. I was going to say, I don't think it was, but Houston Street was one of them. Houston Street would be involved in a very bitter battle for about 3 years about the property, who legally owned it. Did the convention or did the church? When that took place, it took place late at night in the one day that was always dedicated to McMaster and education. And we're told that Dr. Shields asked for the floor. And he said, it is one of the greatest honors that has ever been done to him as a Christian, that he had been expelled from the convention. And that gives you a bit of the feeling of him. He's the moxie, but also the sadness that should have been there wasn't there. There were many who stayed in the convention who at the time were conservative, loved the scriptures, loved the Lord, were committed theologically to everything Shields was committed to in terms of core values, but they didn't like Shields and they felt they couldn't go out with him. And so those sorts of times are times for sadness, but Shields apparently led the churches out, the delegates of the churches. They went to a nearby church and we're told they spent the entire night. Shields was, he regularly stayed up to 3 or 4 in the morning. He would have his dinner around 8 or 9 at night. I've spoken to men like W.S. Whitcomb, and they were young men at the time, and Shields would invite them over to his house, and around 9 o'clock at night, he'd have a huge roast beef dinner, the whole shebang, and he'd be geared up to stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning. And so it was nothing to TT to lead them out, and they apparently spent the entire night singing hymns to God and thanking the Lord for the clarity he had given in their being removed from the old convention so that they could now rebuild. It was very easy, and you could see here, by the way, I don't have any pictures for tonight, and I apologize, but I do have one slide I will show you. It was very easy for those in the convention to dismiss Dr. Shields' charges and just say, he's an abrasive individual. They could point to things that had taken place in the early 20s at Jarvis Street. In 1921, the church had a membership of around 700 or 800. And everything went well through the 19 teens. Dr. Shields was away, if you remember, I mentioned this, often overseas at the front. He actually went to the front to see the conditions of Canadian soldiers. He would love to have been a chaplain. It didn't happen. And during the teens, things were fine at Jarvis Street. But in the late 19 teens, Dr. Shields began to be concerned about the activities of some of the deacons in the church who would prioritize worldly amusements over church life. And in 1921, early in 1921, he preached a sermon against worldly amusements. And one of the marks of what we call fundamentalism was somewhat of a legalism, and regarding things like, can we go to movies? Can we go and see plays? Can we go and hear concerts? And Dr. Shields, and it probably was a reaction to some of what he felt was some of the worldliness of some of the leading figures at Jarvis Street, and he preached this sermon. And the consequence was a pushback against his leadership. And in early 1921, at the monthly business meeting, on April the 29th, a number of the deacons brought to the floor a vote of non-confidence in Dr. Shields' leadership. When the vote was tabulated, and the question was, should our pastor resign? Because we, as a number of deacons, have lost confidence in him. They felt, and rightly so, they actually felt that he had criticized them without naming them in the sermon, and he had. And the vote, Dr. Shields stood and said, unless he was vindicated by a substantial majority, he would indeed resign. When the vote was tabulated, 199 present said yes, he should resign. 284 said no. Now, I'm not sure, I'm not good at math, but however you cut that, it doesn't look like a substantial majority. At that point, Dr. Shields was about to address the floor, but some of those who supported him asked for a motion to censure the deacons who had dared to question Dr. Shields' leadership. It was too late in the evening. That there had been debate all night, and it was too late in the evening to take the vote. And so it was decided that they would put off the vote until June the 20th, the end of June. And the meeting came at the end of June, and before they could take a vote about the censuring of the deacons, a number of people brought to the floor, we'd like to have another vote on whether or not our pastor should resign or not. So there was been no warning of this. I'm not sure how. I've been in many business meetings, but I've never figured out how things are done. I've never been I've just had to sit there, and I assume everybody knows, the people leading the meeting know the Robert Rules of Order, which were followed. And I'm not sure whether you could bring a motion like that from the floor without announcing it ahead of time, but it was brought to the floor. So there was a second vote of non-confidence. And this time, 204 said, yes, we think Shields should resign. 176 said no. So Shields lost the second vote. I think at this point, if probably most pastors would have felt half the church is against me, I probably need to exit. Shields got up and refused to resign. He said that the vote was kind of in some ways illegitimate. And he said, what we'll do is we'll have a tiebreaker vote in September. Because in the summer, a lot of the very wealthy, and there were a lot of wealthy members of Jarvis Street, would go up north to the Muskoka Baptist, not Muskoka Baptist Conference, that doesn't exist yet, but the Muskoka Baptist world. I mean, Muskoka was filled with Baptist cottages in this period of time. And a lot of the wealthy would go up there, and Dr. Shields probably knew that. And while many of them were away, he made the decision to bring in a high-powered evangelist from the United States, had a whole week of evangelistic meetings in which Shields was delighted that around 50, actually 46 professions of faith were made. He immediately baptized them all, brought them into membership. So the third and final vote came, now notice number 46, so keep that in mind. The third and final vote came in September. And everybody turned out pretty well for there was 700 there, over 700 who came, members who came. Should Dr. Shields resign? Remember now at the beginning of all this palaver, Shields had said unless he was supported by a substantial majority, he would resign. Should Dr. Shields resign? 310, yes. 351, no. Remember 46? 46 have been brought into membership. They wouldn't have had a clue about any of this probably. And the difference of vote is 41. I mean, if a man today was going to be, say, brought to West Highland, I'm not sure the percentage that you have to be appointed pastor, but I'm pretty certain it's much greater than 50%. 50% of the church voted against him. Shields refused to resign. Nonetheless, this is 1921, before the McMaster controversy, and 341 left within a few weeks to form ultimately what is Yorkminster Park Baptist Church, which is, if you ever go into the church building, it's very, very different from Jarvis Street. In fact, the first time I went in there, I thought it was in a Presbyterian church. Just the whole way the building was structured, it didn't look Baptist at all. And probably the majority of the wealthiest people in Jarvis Street left the church. One of the key figures was a man named D.E. Thompson, who wrote up the whole story of this debate. Dr. Shields, of course, wrote his own story. And D.E. Thompson described Shields this way: he is a dictator, a self-appointed bishop. Another critic of Shields in this period described him as the Pope of Jarvis Street. Now, Jarvis Street is the premier Baptist church in the entire Baptist Convention of Ontario and Quebec. And so you can see then, during the 25-27 controversy, people would have known about this internal struggle. And they would basically see, you've got this, in there, some of the opponents of Shields could easily say he's an arrogant, power-hungry individual who has no leadership skills, but he wants to dominate. He's dominating his church, and he wants to dominate the convention, and we're not going to let him do that. And it was very easy to pass this off as a personality issue. And there is no doubt that Dr. Shields could be very abrasive. And if you didn't agree with him, as we will see, it could be trouble. But at the heart of the controversy was theology, and whether or not one could allow men to teach within the school that was training pastors who did not believe in the full inerrancy and inspiration of the Holy Scriptures, who signed a document in which they affirmed that, but they didn't believe that, obviously, because they were teaching differently in the classroom. And so at the heart of the whole issue is theology. Now, before I move on to the formation of the Union, let me show you, this is a real nugget. I remember the first time I read this. It's a letter, and it's a letter that Dr. Shields wrote in 1929. And I'll give you the background in a second. One of the absolute gems for a historian of this period is Dr. Shields' correspondence. It runs to probably 40 to 50 linear feet of documents. That is boxes, you line boxes up. It's in the basement of Jarvis Street Baptist Church. I've been there numerous times, not to study his work, his letters, but a lot of the other documents they have. And I've gone through the correspondence. It's all been cataloged. And he would eventually, by the 30s and 40s, he was corresponding with most of the leading evangelicals and fundamentalists in the English-speaking world, had an enormous influence. And then in the 40s, he gets himself into a huge controversy with the Premier of Ontario, a man named Hepburn. And he has all kinds of correspondence about that. Apparently, I've never seen it though. Queen's Park in their archives has a large volume of literature on Dr. Shields because the government of Ontario kept tabs on him quite closely because he became very heavily political in the 40s. Now, among the letters, I remember coming across this letter. It's a letter written in 1929, 2 years after the controversy and the formation of the regular Baptist churches has taken place. And Dr. Shields received in the mail, he was still on the mailing list of McMaster, and they sent out to him a complimentary tie with the McMaster colors. But it was a clip-on tie. And I'm going to show you the letter. It's a gem because it kind of capsulizes Dr. Shields. So give me a sec here. I'll do the share screen. And here we go. So here's the letter. And let me bring this over here. So I hope you can see that. I will read it. So it's written to a man named E.J. Bengal. E.J., I think that's how you name. I mean, it's the O-U-G spelling in English is a real tough one, right? It could be like thou, cough, but I think it's Bengal. He was the registrar at McMaster University, and Dr. Shields returned the tie and said the following: Dear Mr. Bengal, I'm venturing to impose upon your good nature by returning to you a parcel which reached my house today. You will find it is labeled in Compliments of McMaster University. As I do not know the name of the anonymous friend to whom I am indebted for this generous gift, I'm returning it to you in the hope that you may be able to discover him. I beg to assure my anonymous friend that I appreciate his kind intention to the full, and I return it only because he has evidently underestimated my size. This shirt is labeled Defiance brand. It must have been on the label, but it's only 15 and a half. While my size is 17. That's the next size. Therefore, like a good many other things from the same source, there's a double meaning there. If I may say so without offense, it's rather too small for me. Perhaps the donor may be able to send to me a garment of the proper size. And as to the tie, please tell him I do not wear ties of that sort. I always tie my own. And a ready-made tie, especially if it be secondhand, involves a kind of plagiarism, a lack of originality, an appropriation of somebody else's ideas and labor. In fact, a kind of misrepresentation, which is entirely alien to my constitution. You may inform the donor I usually wear bow ties, and I tie them myself. If my anonymous friend should find it impossible to return this garment to the store in exchange for a larger size, I have no doubt he'll be able to find a good many people about McMaster University small enough to wear it. With the warmest personal regards, I beg to describe myself very sincerely yours, and then Dr. Shields. And that's a fascinating letter. And then you read between the lines, he's actually making a criticism of McMaster and using the returning of the tie to do so. But you get a real feel for the man. I mean, he's got a gift with the English language. Those who heard him preach would testify just the brilliance of his ability to hold audiences with his oratory, really, his language. But there's also a bit of a mischievousness there as well. And his desire not to follow in anybody else's footsteps. And his desire to be an original is there too. So in 1927, let me just close that out. In 1927, then, the churches were read out of the old convention at a dozen churches, including Stanley Avenue and Houston Street. And a year later, on November the 27th to the 30th of November 1928, at Stanley Avenue Baptist Church, a new denomination was formed, known as the Union of Regular Baptist Churches. It's 1928, then, the formation of the Union of Regular Baptist Churches. There were 77 churches there. 12 of the original churches that were kicked out of the convention, and 65 others that had pulled out in the year. In the Stanley Avenue Minute books, it said it was an historic occasion, and it was in many ways. A splendid gathering, the services being bright, happy, and inspirational. It's interesting the words that were used. I'm not sure we would have used bright and happy today to describe, and I'm not saying it wasn't, I'm just saying it's interesting the way we use adjectives and how adjectives change. The membership of these churches were around 8,500 members. And this is the nucleus of the fellowship. All these churches would eventually go into the fellowship, except for maybe half a dozen. And so really the fellowship goes back, I mean, our roots go back to the old convention, and even further back, what we looked at last year, the English Baptist churches in England. But in terms of historic continuity, 1928 is a very key date, because it basically is the first iteration of a solidly conservative group of churches that is based around the inerrancy and infallibility of the Word of God. There were great hopes that the union would grow. Dr. Shields was elected the first president. They would have this every year. They'd have a president elected, and then there'd be an ongoing secretary. Morley Hall would work with Shields, because Morley Hall was the secretary for many years. By 1931, the union had 90 churches. There were other churches that came out of the old convention, like Hyde Park Baptist Church with John Linton, who I mentioned last week. He never joined the union. And he didn't join the union because he didn't think that Dr. Shields could lead the churches in peacetime, as it were. Shields was a great warrior, and he was the sort of man you need. Like the whole experience of schism within a denomination and the friction it causes should weigh upon the heart. And it has similar effects to what the last 2 years have had for many of us. It's been a difficult time. Psychologically, it's been difficult. And to go through a prolonged crisis of battling for truth with churches has a telling effect upon people. And you need a different type of leader. Once there's no enemy, so to speak. And Linton didn't feel that Shields was that man. And Linton was right. Shields was the perfect man you needed in the 20s. I mean, he was absolutely fearless, and he had moxie. But was he the man to lead the churches now that there was no fight going on? In 1931, it had grown to 90 churches. But that year, there was controversy about two organizations. There was controversy about the Women's Missionary Society, which was run, the head of that was a woman named Mrs. C.J. Holman. Her husband, I'm not even sure I know her maiden name. Her actual name. C.J. Holman was a deacon at Jarvis Street. He had died in the early part of the century. He was a very prominent figure. And Mrs. C.J. Holman lived about 40 years after his death. She was a very strong woman. And but Dr. Shields didn't like the idea of a woman running the Women's Missionary Society. Well, you think like it's a woman's missionary society, like what's the problem? Shields didn't like that. And it ended up, he basically kicked the Women's Missionary Society out of Jarvis Street. That's where it was centered. And Mrs. C.J. Holman joined Houston Street Baptist Church, but she only went to Houston Street once a month when they had communion. The other 3 Sundays of the month, she sat in the front row at Jarvis Street. She also had moxie. She said, okay, so I've been kicked out of the church in one sense, but he's the best preacher in Toronto. So why would I want to go elsewhere? She took her membership to Houston Street, which is interesting. I don't know how she got back and forth. This is the 1920s, right? There's no QEW. You have to use Highway 2. I can't imagine the cars went that fast on that highway. So it'd probably take her all day to get back and forth on Sundays, but be that as it may, three Sundays a week, she was at Jarvis Street, and she basically sat through his whole ministry, and she survived him. She died in the 60s. And there was also a controversy about the FBYPA, the Fundamentalist Baptist Young People's Association, not the Fellowship Baptist Young People's Association. That's what it would become, the FBYPA. And Dr. Shields, he didn't like parachurch organizations. He felt they took away from the local church. And between 1931 and 1933, there was again controversy within the union. Not again, but this is the first time. And by 1933, they've lost 30 churches. And there are only 60 churches left in the union. And among the people who went out were J.F. Holliday, our recently departed brother, his father, John F. Holliday. John F. Holliday had studied at McMaster. He had been ordained at Stanley Avenue Baptist Church before the controversy. And he would become a key figure in the fellowship. He founded Muskoka Baptist Conference, right? MBC, which is now Muskoka Bible Center. But he was one of the key figures who founded that. And he just couldn't abide by Shields's, in his mind, seeking to dominate every facet of the union. The other figure who went out was, some of you will remember, Pastor Murray Pipe, his father, Norman W. Pipe, who was born in 1909, died in the year 2000. He left with Holliday, and they formed in 1933 the Fellowship of Independent Baptist Churches. So 1927, the churches are expelled from the old convention. 1928, they formed the Union of Regular Baptist Churches. The little word regular there means closed communion. It means the churches observed regular order. Baptism first, and then the Lord's table. And if you were not baptized, you wouldn't be able to partake of the table. That was also an issue that was at the time, but somewhere in the 1930s, that kind of disappears as an issue. And then 1933 is the formation of the Fellowship of Independent Baptist Churches. They were fed up with TT. They were fed up with the organization that he was trying to dominate. And about 30 of them founded it. Between 1933, they grew from 30 to 1950. In 17 years, they grew from 30 to 124. And many of them, churches disgruntled with Dr. Shields. And Norman Pipe said the Fellowship of Independent Baptist Churches was designed to have, quote, a minimal amount of organization and a maximum amount of fellowship. And with a great stress on independence. There were also theological differences. The union tended to be amillennial. There is no, the millennium is the life of the church, the history of the church. There's no actual millennium at the end of history, 1,000-year reign. The Fellowship of Independent Baptist Churches tended to be premillennial. That is, there will be an earthly millennium, and many of them tended to be pre-tribulational premillennial. So Christ will return before the tribulation, rapture the church, then you'll have a 7-year tribulation, the Antichrist, the showdown at Armageddon, and the Antichrist defeated, and then Christ would return, establish a millennial reign from Jerusalem and of 1,000 years. So there's differences between the union over ecclesiology, the church. Dr. Shields is very much down on parachurch organizations, and he's very committed to closed communion. And the Fellowship of Independent Baptist Churches, they're not as concerned about parachurch organizations, and they're open communion. You don't have to be baptized as a believer to partake of the Lord's Supper. And then eschatology is also a divider between the two groups. There was another serious battle in 1937. This had to do with mission. The Union of Regular Baptist Churches had a mission in Liberia. In the 1940s, that was a difficult period for everybody. It's the war years. Dr. Shields is too old to go as a chaplain to the front now, but he was an ardent defender of the British Empire. And one thing I haven't mentioned is there are stories, I've never been able to confirm these, that during the First World War, he would give altar calls for people to join up in the Canadian Army. He would invite young men in the congregation to come forward to enlist rather than to be converted. I've never seen those confirmed. Dr. Shields regularly used the altar call. In 1938, there was a great fire, a devastating fire in Jarvis Street. It destroyed the sanctuary. So if you go to Jarvis Street today, the sanctuary you're seeing is a 1939 rebuild. And when he rebuilt it, it was to the exact specifications, except with one difference. There was only one stairwell up into the balcony, and he put stairwells at the either end of them so it could facilitate altar calls. And I should mention during the 20s, during that whole controversy, Jarvis Street was packed, and they lost 340 people, members, but they soon replaced those within a decade. There were hundreds of conversions through the 20s. And so it's a very difficult period to determine. God is definitely greatly at work. And yet Dr. Shields is a difficult individual in many ways. In the 1940s, there were further controversies. Dr. Shields broke with Morley Hall, who had been the secretary of the Union. 1948, 1949 was the key break. The key break came, and I need to keep a look on the time here, with a man named W. Gordon Brown, who was born in 1904. He died in 1979. I never met Dr. Brown. I obviously met numerous people that knew him. He's really the founding, he is the founding dean of Central Baptist Seminary, which became Heritage Theological Seminary. He was brilliant. If you use an NIV, the Gospel of John was translated by him. He was one of the key translators in the New Testament. He personally translated the Gospel of John, which then obviously would go through whatever teams would have done that work. His wife, Louise Wise Brown, they never had any children. She was just as gifted. Again, I've heard stories, I don't know how you would confirm these today now, that at home they would talk to each other in New Testament Greek. I don't know if that's true. That would give you significant limitations. I mean, could you get the milk out the fridge? No fridges in the New Testament time, so I don't know if that's true. But she was quite brilliant, and when Central Baptist Seminary was formed, she would actually teach Greek to the students. And I've met men who studied under Louise Brown. Dr. Brown had taken his degree at McMaster. He'd been a prominent figure in the controversy because he was in the classes of L.H. Marshall, if we remember him. He had done further studies at Southern Baptist Seminary, where I'm full-time. And he could have gone on, he got an MA at the University of Toronto. He could have gone on to a doctorate, but Dr. Shields asked him if he would come and teach at the newly formed Toronto Baptist Seminary, which he did. And in time, he began teaching full-time at Toronto Baptist Seminary, as well as being the pastor of Runnymede Baptist Church in Toronto, which is no longer in the fellowship. It left the fellowship during the Toronto Airport debacle in the 1990s. And But he was the pastor. He was the full-time pastor there. He had an interesting visitation style. I don't know how long pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID our pastors would take on a pastoral visit. I suspect, an hour and a half. I was an elder for a number of years at Baptist Church in Burlington, and we would visit congregants, and I'd usually one visit in the night, right? You go around 7:30 and you spend a bit of time in chit chat, and then eventually you get to talk about their spiritual state. And by the time you leave, it's about 8:30, about 9:30, 10 o'clock. Dr. Brown scheduled, it's just wild, 15-minute pastoral visits. He came in, right to business. How's your prayer life? How are you doing spiritually? Anything I can pray about? Let's pray. And he was out the door. I've read reports he gave that in a given year, this is when he was the interim pastor for a number of years at Forward Baptist Church in the 40s. And I was going through the minutes about 3 years ago, and I read reports. Dr. Brown told us he had visited 890 families during the course of 1944. And you're thinking, like, 800, there's only 365 days in the year. Like, and then you remember, 15-minute visits. I mean, it's wild. So he was very, very very conscious of time. His prayers apparently were clipped, very short. I remember being told by a brother named Jack Hanna, who studied under him. Some of you know Pastor Hanna. Remember he would often come in when you were taking an exam. Dr. Brown would come in and he'd pray something like, brains, brains, brains. Lord, give us brains. Amen. That would be his prayer for the students. So he's eccentric, enormously strong. And I'm not sure how much stock one puts in, A style. Is it personality A? I'm not even sure what the types are, but he's basically cut from the same cloth as Shields. And it's not going to be surprising that in the late 40s, they came into conflict. And they came into conflict over the issue, should we allow students from the Fellowship of Independent Baptist Churches to study at Toronto Baptist Seminary? The seminary was set up for the Union of Regular Baptist Churches. They're funding it. It's on Jarvis Street's land. But you've now got, by the late 40s, you've got 120 Fellowship of Independent Baptist Churches. They haven't got a school to go to. Well, they could go to Toronto Bible College, where some did go, which would eventually become Tyndale. And then there was a small school in London called London College of the Bible and Mission. But many of those in Toronto wanted to study in Toronto. And so Gordon Brown said, we need to admit them. We differ from these brethren. He wouldn't have said this. Basically over you, Dr. Shields. We differ on eschatology and maybe a few little bits on ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, but we should admit them. And finally, things came to a head. There were other things going on here too. I mean, you've got two men who are very strong individuals. Dr. Shields, by this point in time, is 75 years of age. And he probably should have either stepped down to a lesser role or retired. And one of the problems with leadership is authority and power. And how does a pastor who's enjoyed, and I'm at that age now, right? I'm past my mid-60s. And how do you step back in terms of ministry? And how do you give up those roles that have been integral to your identity. I mean, I've seen it far too often where pastors, being the pastor is their identity. And how do you give that up? The respect, the preaching, and the authority even. And Dr. Shields couldn't. And Dr. Brown at this point is in his 40s. And you've got this clash between two men who are very, very similar. And in the minute books, if you had the minute books of Toronto Baptist Seminary, you'd be able to read in the course of 1948, Dr. Shields at one business meeting or one faculty meeting accuses Dr. Brown of being a liberal. The conversation runs something like the following from Shields' side. I've been having problems with you, Dr. Brown, and I finally figured out what the problem is. You're a liberal. And he fired him. Two key figures in the union, Hal McBain, actually three key figures, Hal McBain, who is just a remarkable Christian pastor, at the time pastor of Temple Baptist Church in Sarnia, and Jack Watt, who I remember hearing preach. I don't think I know him. I knew Dr. McBain fairly well because he was the chancellor of Central Baptist Seminary. Jack Watt was the pastor of Campbell Avenue Baptist Church in Windsor. And Jack Scott, who was, again, a remarkable Christian statesman. He was at Forward Baptist Church. He had served as a chaplain during the Second World War. That's when W. Gordon Brown took over as a kind of an interim for him. And those three men went to talk to Shields and pled with him not to plunge the Union into another controversy. They thought they had succeeded, but they hadn't. And during 1948, 1949, the leaders like McBain and Jack Scott felt that they had to form a new school. And in 1949, they formed Central Baptist Seminary. Initially, it was located at Forward Baptist Church. It would then relocate to St. George and then relocate to where I started teaching on out near Victoria Park Avenue. And there were 75 students at Toronto Baptist Seminary. 50 of them left for the new school, and pretty well most of the faculty. Brown was the first president, the first dean, a position he held till 1973. And we'll talk a little bit more about him later next week. And the first president was Jack Scott. And one of the very interesting things I came across, I did a biography of Dr. McBain. And Dr. McBain's daughter, Grace, Grace Sylvester, her husband is Alan Sylvester. When I was doing the biography, they invited me to come and look at Dr. McBain's correspondence that they had and his notebooks. He had about 100 journals. It was absolutely fabulous. He would write in his diary every day, usually a page, what the day had been. And so he's got all kinds of detail about the late 40s and the break with Dr. Shields. Also, they had a box of letters which had never been opened. And Dr. McBain had given them this box of letters, and it was correspondence between him and a man named Arnold Dallimore. Dr. Dallimore is probably well known to some of you. He wrote the Life of George Whitefield, massive 2-volume life. And he was the pastor of Cottam Baptist Church for many years, little church down near Windsor. And in the very late 40s, Dr. Dallimore was born 1911, died in 1998. In the late 40s, he had been at a church in London and basically had a nervous breakdown. And he had gone to New York, to a sanatorium in New York for about 4 months to recuperate. None of this is really widely known. And during that time, he would write every week to Dr. McBain. And Dr. McBain told him about the struggle with Shields, and they had gone to see Shields, and Shields was adamant that ultimately he wasn't going to reconcile with Brown. And in one letter, Dallimore told McBain this: "Your union news makes me sick. Dr. Shields, with all his matchless gifts, is little better than a spoiled child." And then he said, "This is a good spanking is in order." That's pretty strong. And then about a year later, he wrote to this. A few months later. "As far as preaching goes, Dr. Shields is incomparably above any preacher I've ever heard. It is evident that Dr. Shields could have been the leader of Canadian evangelicals if only he had lost his big shot attitude, if he had more of what lesser men have: Christian kindness, humility, love, and grace." Even his brother, I have a letter from his brother, E.E. Shields. He died in 1952. And he wrote to a man named John Armstrong, who was the general secretary of the union in the early 50s. John Armstrong be a key founder of the fellowship. And E.E. Shields says this: "I could almost weep when I think of the way in which my brother has led so many of you by the nose in the past, instead of leading in introducing a constitution which would have given liberty to all." That is the way the union was set up. "You will see that notwithstanding my brother's charm and his great abilities, his obsessions cause him to act at times in ways which are not the part of sober, sane, responsible men." That's his own brother. And it raises this whole issue, which is obviously a big issue for me because of my context, but it's a big issue for all of us. What does pastoral leadership look like? What is a good leader? Dr. Shields excelled in the pulpit, but was he a great leader? He was the man for the hour in the 20s, but I would say ultimately he was not a great leader. He couldn't work with men unless he dominated them. In the early 50s, when the fellowship is formed, only 10 churches would remain with Shields. I've seen pictures, these big pictures that they would do of these kind of panoramic shots of groups of people. And I've seen a picture of the founding convention with all the founding pastors, about 70 to 80 men. Dr. Shields right in the center, W. Gordon Brown there, and so on. By 1950, only about half a dozen men, maybe 10, were still in fellowship with Shields. He had cut off relations with the rest of them. Even with men like C.J. Loney. When C.J. Loney supported McBain, Shields made a comment about his size. He was quite short. He was about a little shorter than me. and Shields said something like, "He's a little man. His size tells you what he's like spiritually. And the only way I'd ever talk to him again is if he came back here on his knees." One of the men that I knew very well was a man named Bob Shaker. Bob was a fascinating figure. He ran a bookstore in Toronto on Avenue Road. And it was a great bookstore. And he had a sign in the front of the window, "Solid Christian literature, no fluff." And what was great about going to buy books, I mean, I love books. Bob died probably about within the last 10 years. He was about 98, 99. He lived with his three sisters, all of whom were not married, and all of whom lived into their late 90s. It was an intriguing household. I went to his house when he was quite ill once or twice. And Bob was a deacon with Dr. Shields. He loved Dr. Shields. He wouldn't have appreciated some of this talk tonight because he almost idolized Shields. when Shields was dying in the hospital in 55, he had heart issues. He had friends smuggle in bottles of cream, which he would chug. I told you he's quite eccentric. He said to Dr. Bob Shaker, and I've never forgotten Bob telling me this, almost with tears in his eyes. He said, Dr. Shields said to me a number of times, all my children have left me. And he was referring to all those men like Dr. Brown and Dr. McBain and Dr. Scott, whom he had all mentored. And the tragedy of it is he didn't realize that his personality was a significant player in that. He was a great man in many ways, but he was not a model of leadership. And that's something we need to pray, that God would give us leaders strong in the pulpit, but men of humility and grace and gentleness. There's been a lot of talk in the recent days because of what's been going on in Eastern Europe with Zelensky and Putin about leadership. And it's something that we need to think about seriously in the church as well, and pray that God would give us good leaders, men who are strong in the word of God, in the preaching of the word, but also men of humility and gentleness and kindness. Well, let me stop here, ask if there are any questions. Just a reminder, two things. Next week, what I'd like to do then is look at the formation of the fellowship, probably mostly the 50s and the 60s. I'm going to spend a little time on the confession of faith of the fellowship. But remember, we're going to be at the church building. So we're going to be at 6 o'clock in the sanctuary at West Highland on Garth. So just remember that, okay? So are there any questions before Jamie closes in a word of prayer?
Yeah, I have a question about Houston Street. I understood that Houston Street came out of James Street Baptist Church. Is that correct? And
correct.
About when did that happen? That
would probably have been I would think it's the early part. Now, I should know this. I actually wrote the history of Houston Street. I think it's the early 20th century. I think it's before 1910. Give me a sec here. I've got the history here somewhere. Let's see here. No. Yeah, I'm wrong. 1887. So it was 1887 when it was founded. James Street Baptist Church, again, that was, again, there's a sadness there, because James Street founded Wentworth Street Baptist Church, James Stanley Avenue Baptist Church, Houston Street Baptist Church. They founded probably half a dozen churches. And in Hamilton, really the mother church of Baptist churches is James Street. Dundas Baptist Church, just down the road from where I live, is older. But James Street was the kind of the mother of Baptist churches in Hamilton during the 19th century. So yeah, you're right. It was so it was James Street, but it was 1887, the 1880s.
I have a comment/question. And so before this class today, I was reading an article I think I sent you maybe 2 years ago. I'm not sure if you remember, Dr. Haykin. It's written by my grandfather, called Reverence or Rascals. And it's by Frank Strickland, and who many of you on the call might also know, who was at West Highland. I won't tell you what he wrote about Pastor Mahaffey, whether he was a reverend or a rascal, but he was writing about how, because he was at Jarvis Street and knew Dr. Shields. He said he was a good friend of Canadian Prime Minister R.B. Bennett as well. Had a dislike for Ontario Premier Mitchell Hepburn, which you mentioned, but it seems like he knew a lot of like influential people, Bob Jones in the States. He also mentions Ian Paisley, who was he described as a fiery Irish pastor and politician. And they were together, I guess, against the Roman Catholic Church at the time. So I'm just wondering, like, what are some of the, like, does the church need like a character like this for a certain time for like you kind of described that Dr. Shields did a lot, that it's almost like a Winston Churchill. You needed a guy like that to face Hitler. Was that, do you see like similarities there? And is there things that we can learn about positively interacting with culture from Shields, or is it only negative?
No, I think there is. I mean, there was a deep concern for theological education. Shields was very convinced that the gospel applies to all of life. In the 40s, he became heavily political, hence his conflicts with Mitchell Hepburn, his conflicts with the Ottawa government. The Ottawa government during the war, the Second World War, allowed the Mass to be said on Parliament Hill. And Dr. Shields felt that that was a violation of separation of church and state, which he felt was fundamental to who we are as Canadians. I mean, one area, and I'm not, please don't take me as suggesting this, he took very seriously the separation of church and state, to the point that he refused to ever use tax exemption. During his ministry, Jarvis Street paid taxes on that land. I can't imagine what the taxes would be today on that land. And I don't think the church does that now. And I'm not suggesting that. Please note, I'm not suggesting the West Highland do that. I mean, I think we should take advantage of what the government gives us until they take it away. And I can't doubt that they probably will move in that direction, but be that as it may. He was a big B Baptist. He took seriously who we are as Baptists and what that meant. And there's much there that is a solid. He preached the gospel. And I've met many men and women who are saved under him. But he was a very difficult man to work with in terms of building collegiality and building basically the denomination. And he is the sort of man you want in war, like Churchill. It's interesting that Churchill was voted out of office not long after the end of the Second World War. And I'm not sure whether that's because he couldn't run England as the prime minister during a peacetime. But Dr. Shields was, I mean, the problem is once you've engaged in the sort of internecine fighting against liberal theology within a denomination, you've learned the ways of war to the point that it's very difficult to put down your weapons. And it strikes me what happens during the 30s and the 40s. And this happens with other fundamentalist leaders like Bob Jones, like J. Frank Norris in Texas, W.B. Riley in Wisconsin, I think, Minneapolis, is that once they had fought the liberals and there had been breaks or divisions and they had conservative denominations, they kept fighting others. There always had to be somebody, there always had to be a controversy. And Shields was definitely the man for the 20s, but he wasn't the man to lead these churches in the 30s and the 40s. Or again, the issue is if he had retired, he was born in 1873. So if he had retired around 1943, about 12 years before his death, or even 10 years before his death, we'd remember him very differently. That the break in 48, 49 was a brutal break with McBain and with Dr. Brown and with Dr. Scott and these men. And again, I've spoken to a number of these people at the time, and W.S. Whitcomb, Bob Holmes. And Bob Holmes was a student. And he remembers the day when he was taking the streetcar down to Jarvis Street, and the streetcar went by Toronto Baptist Seminary, but it would eventually go by Forward Baptist Church, where Central had just been founded. And Central just started their course of program, and he had a choice in his mind: do I get off at Gerard or keep going? And he kept going, and he never regretted that. But it was very difficult for these men. They didn't want to break with Dr. Shields. They owed him enormous debt, but he was implacable, and they really couldn't work with him unless he dominated them. And so it's the complexity. There's a complexity there, and how do you? It's the same sort of thing that's come up, and I don't want to get into this with George Whitefield recently. That George Whitefield was a slave owner. And Whitefield actually was instrumental in introducing slavery into Georgia. Georgia was a state, a colony that was set up not to have slaves. And Whitefield brought slaves into Savannah because he had acquired land, an orphanage called Bethesda, just outside Savannah. And he wrongly felt the only people who could work it would be African Americans. What do you do with that? As you can imagine, I mean, I'm a historian. I've written a biography of Whitefield. I lecture on him. I'm actually writing a book on revival right now, and I've got a whole chapter on Whitefield, and I have to deal with that issue. It's become a very pressing one, and you can't avoid it. You can't. I don't want to throw him under the bus, so to speak, or cancel him, as some people talk today. But there's a major problem here. And I'm not being anachronistic, because there were many in his day, Christians, who said, this is wrong, fundamentally wrong. And yet he participated in that sin. Here's a man that God remarkably used in revival, yet he was involved in really what his fellow evangelist, John Wesley, said was an abomination before God. So our heroes in the past have failings, but the Bible, right? We have to follow the way the Bible depicts people. Abraham, David. It tells us warts and all. Pastor Mahaffey?
Yeah, Michael, I want to thank you for tonight. This brought back a lot of memories for me. I did take 1 or 2 classes with Dr. Gordon Brown at Central Baptist Seminary, and my wife studied under him. She took his Life of Christ class, which was an outstanding class. And you mentioned, of course, the impact that he had in being one of the translators of the New International Version. And I think what really stands out in my mind is all of the names of individuals you've mentioned today were outstanding leaders in one way or another, especially those, I'm thinking of those men who finally broke away from Shields, and the great debt of gratitude that we have for them. But I'm thinking of Gordon Brown, who really is not known well. He's sort of a name that's slipped off everybody's radar. But I'm not sure if those listening tonight, watching tonight, realize this, but Gordon Brown had a profound influence on D.A. Carson. And so not only did Gordon Brown train some outstanding leaders in our fellowship, but Don Carson is perhaps the most well-known theologian in the world today, and the founder of the Gospel Coalition, excuse me. And so, you just a profound effect on different leaders, and we have a lot to give God thanks for. The influence goes far beyond our own fellowship of churches.
Yep.
Is essentially what I'm saying. It's touched the evangelical world.
Yep.
So praise God.
Yep, very much so.
Dr. Haykin, when I was a young boy in Verdun, our pastor was Pastor Hackett, and he used to talk about his 3 Jacks, Jack Hanna, Jack Scott, and I can't remember the third Jack.
Jack Watt?
Mm-hmm. He was a man, Pastor Hackett, as a little boy, I remember my mother asked me what I thought of him. I said, when he comes out, he just smiles and he loves people. He loved people to Christ.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we will look forward to seeing you all at the church next week, and Pastor Strickland will close our time in prayer.
All right, Lord, we're grateful for this last hour and what we can take from it. And we do reflect on some of these leaders and how we learn about them, warts and all. But God, we thank you that you do use us even with our warts. And for each one of us listening, I pray that you'd give us courage to serve you wherever we are. I pray that, again, just we would be found faithful to your word, that we would love the gospel that Dr. Shields and the other men that we learned about tonight loved as well. And that just kind of the ripple effect of some of these individuals we heard, Dr. Brown and others, would just continue. And may we continue to be faithful in our time, such that many more would come to faith in Christ in Hamilton, in the rest of our country, and to the nations as well. So be with us now as well this week, and bring us back together next week. We look forward to being together in person, both for Sunday morning worship, as well as trek in the evening together. And so we just thank you for your grace and love toward us. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Have a great week. God bless.